and get started. We got a lot of information to cover. We extended this to an hour and a half. This is the first time going through this presentation, so I'm not sure of the cadence. Hopefully we'll get through all of it without rushing through it too fast. As always, today's webinar is being recorded. It'll be uploaded to the YouTube channel, where you can find by searching SPEER on YouTube, or you can go to our website directly, which is eepartnership.org, and under the news section, you'll find it on our resources page. On the resource page, you'll find a link to our channel. So within 72 hours of this presentation, you will receive a course completion evaluation email from Kathy Lawrence. Please complete the survey and send it back to her to receive your certificate. That will contain your course ID number that you'll need to use when reporting your CEUs to ICC. As always, the chat feature is open. We'd like to use that for any technical difficulties you may be experiencing during the presentation. And then the Q&A feature is also open. Please use that to post any questions that you might have, and we'll go through them as they come through instead of waiting till the end. We'll go through it as it comes through. So understanding the table, R402.4.1, basically I just call it a deep dive into the building thermal envelope. Before we get started with that, a little bit of housekeeping is intro to SPEER. Those that don't know who SPEER is or what SPEER can do. We've provided training and webinars, in-person and field training, as well as IECC test prep training for those looking to get certified. The price is always right. It's free. We are contracted through SECO and PNNL to actually be able to provide this stuff for you. I can help with any questions regarding the energy code, ASHRAE 90.1, and help with any questions from plan reviewers to building officials to third-party energy inspectors. I'm happy to help in any way that I can. We've also assisted several cities with the adoption of 2021 and how to navigate all the additional amendments that are being made to lessen the impact of the adoption to the builders. There are other cities out there that are taking the lead on changing a few things to make it a little simpler. My contact information will be at the end of this presentation. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'd love to help navigate through the energy code or answer any questions that you might have. So the agenda, it's kind of short, but it's lengthy. And that's kind of contradicting, but we're going to go through the structure, that's short, the intent, which is short, and then the breakdown of the requirements, that gets lengthier with the photos of compliance and non-compliance items as we go through it. This is just a little snippet of the table that's in there. Where I come from, and those that don't know where I come from before, I was with a third-party energy verifier for a decade. This table was near and dear to all of our hearts. We use it as checklists in the field. So I got really accustomed to looking at that. There's always changes to this on every code cycle. Someone's clarifying the wording or redoing the wording or adding another criteria requirement in the table. So it's ever changing. This is out of the 2021. It's the air barrier, air sealing, and insulation installation criteria table, better known as Table R402.4.1.1. This table is meant to basically define the thermal envelope by instructing how to handle the air sealing and insulation of each component that makes up the thermal envelope. Each component is listed on the left with both the air barrier, which is also air sealing, and insulation requirements listed to the right. Of course, this is just a portion of the table. I know it's hard to read on this. The next few slides, we'll go through each one specifically. So how it's kind of broken up is the structure. As you saw a second ago, it's broken up into specific building components. And then to the right, it's actually separated into air sealing and insulation installation criteria. A building or house may not contain all of the components listed, but all that are listed should be in any and or all building and houses that are being constructed. The intent of the table. So what's the intent? How do we follow it? Well, it's often used, as I said a second ago, it's often used as in-field checklists from builder officials to third-party energy verifiers. It's either printed out or it's a manual checklist. Sometimes you can have this scanned into a PDF and moved into something on an iPad which you can use, or it can be digitally reproduced in a fillable PDF form where you have check boxes that you check off when you've actually verified it. Or it can also be incorporated into an inspection app, which is kind of what we had where I came from. Our app incorporated the checklist and we added things to it. This table is not just for prescriptive path, but it's also must be followed by performance and ERI. It is in the prescriptive section, but when you go to the performance and ERI, it references that this table must be, or this section, which includes the table, must be followed for both those paths. Some third-party energy verifiers take it to the next level, which is kind of what we did. You include photos of each of these components, proving that you were A, on site, and B, proving that it was in compliant or it needs to be fixed. The photos can be geo-stamped with location and date and recorded in the house or building file independently. And you can also use it to show any failing items, even annotate those, circle them, and send them to the contractor or the builder for it to be corrected. So here's kind of what's covered. This is the list of each component. Its general requirements, its ceiling, its attic, its walls, windows, skylights, doors, rim joists, floors, including cantilever floors and floors over garage, basement, crawl space, and slab foundations, the shafts and penetrations, narrow cavities, garage separation, recessed lighting, plumbing, wiring, and other obstructions, shower tubs and on the exterior wall or garage wall, electrical foam boxes on exterior walls or garage wall, HVAC register boots, and then concealed sprinklers. So we're going to break down each one of those. As we go through this, please keep in mind where I'm coming from. I didn't help write these. I had nothing to do with how that was put through here. I don't know the true intent of why it was put in here. It's just me interpreting what I see the code meaning. So how I'll be explaining all of these is from the perspective of an energy inspector or third-party energy verifier. And then where I can, I'll include photos of the components being discussed and how it looks to be compliant with the energy code, and then some that aren't compliant to the energy code. Again, before we dive into each one of those, if you have questions, I've got the chat and the Q&A session that's open in front of me. Ask questions on these as we go through it, and we'll answer it as they come through. So the first thing I'll do, and this is how we're structuring the webinar, is I'm going to read off exactly what the table says, and the next few photos will show some real-world scenarios and what we're looking at. But on this, general requirements. So this one is basically stating the obvious. An air barrier must be continuous, and all breaks and joints in that air barrier must be sealed. And insulation should not be used as an air sealing material. So in other words, you can't plug a hole in the air barrier with an air permeable insulation. That includes foam, that includes fiberglass bat. Well, not necessarily foam. It depends on the size of it. You can foam and poly seal, actually it's kind of the same, seal up those holes, but if it's too large, you really should be using something that's more of an air barrier, it's impermeable, not permeable style insulation. This is kind of an example. Here's what we're seeing is being installed as an air barrier. It's T-ply. In this case, there's OSB, there's zip boards, but they all have seams and joints, and all those seams and joints need to be taped, and any penetrations through the air barrier must also be sealed. On the right is a product called Stretch Tape made by Zip. I'm not trying to promote any of their products, but this is what I saw when I was out walking a job site. It's an adhesive tape that can be stretched to create an airtight waterproof seal. As you can see, it's pretty stretched, it's pretty thin, it's transparent in some places where they stretched it. It's closing off any air gaps that are in there. In my opinion, this type of sealing tape meets the intent of code requirements, saying that it must allow for expansion and contraction while maintaining a tight seal and bond for both materials. Poly seal and expandable foam really does not. It will fill the hole, but once it expands and contracts, it will pop and allow air leakage around those areas. I'm not saying this is the only thing that you can use. You can use caulking, you can use other materials. I'm just saying this is a good product that's out there. On the left, you see all the seams are being taped, the flashing tape around the windows being installed, and any penetrations through that air barrier is also being sealed. There's some nails that you can see through there. Most of the time that alone is sealing up that. On the right, where the red T-ply is, you can see caulking being used over the nail heads. We've talked about that in previous presentations that we've done. Same builder that I walked before. This is also kind of the same thing of what they're doing. Another product that Zip has is called flashing tape. This is when installed correctly, it provides waterproofing by directing the water around the opening. In this photo, you can see that there's what I call legs on either side of it, and then there's a header across the top. It's creating a shingle effect, allowing water to continue down and not into the openings. This electrical box is on the front corner wall of the garage, so being airtight is not needed. Just the flashing tape meets the requirement of having water intrusion barrier. And in most things with code, a product is not specified, a specific product's not specified, a brand is not specified. It's not listed in the language anywhere. It's only saying the type of material that should be used, like foam or caulking or other approved means for air sealing. And that approved means is usually up to the CBO, the chief building officials or building officials in that area. They're the ones that can decide whether or not the material being used or product being used meets the criteria of an air sealer. So that's kind of up to them to do. It's just left to general terms of material type. Defining the thermal envelope and creating this boundary does not end at the exterior wall. This was always hard for us to explain this in the field, and always hard for us to try to explain to builders why this is necessary. This photo is a great example. It's the wall under the staircase that's on and adjacent to a garage. This is the garage wall that actually is adjacent to the stairwell or the stair under the staircase inside the interior. Why this needs to be done, and the best way to explain it that I have found on how I explain it to people is, think of the house. If this was a square box and it was a house with nothing else in it, just square walls, 4 square walls, you have all the exterior walls are insulated and all of them will have an interior and exterior air barrier. The exterior is T-ply or OSB or zipboard. The interior is either sheetrock or some other type of hardy board or paneling or something of that that's creating an interior air barrier. Now that you've been asked to build things in front of the walls like staircases or chases or anything like that, where you're going to remove the interior air barrier and you're going to build the structure, now that interior air barrier must be reinstalled and sealed after the new things are attached to the exterior wall or garage wall. These include staircases, duct chases, under tubs and showers, and under water heater platforms and decks. So both the exterior and interior air barrier must exist. Missing one or the other creates a misalignment of the air barrier and thermal boundary, which together make up the thermal envelope of the building. That's why code specifies that these must be continuous and always aligned. So if they ever are out of alignment, that's a misalignment of the thermal envelope, either on the air barrier or thermal boundary side, which both make up the thermal envelope. So hopefully that explains it better. We always explain it to builders that way, and they start to understand that if this structure was not here, you would already have an air barrier like sheetrock. Once you've removed that or did not install it because of the way it's being framed, you still have to have an interior air barrier. Netting does not and is not included in that. Netting is not an air barrier. Netting is only to hold insulation in place. That used to be the case. It used to be used before in previous building styles. It is now, it needs to be replaced. I still see builders allowing this to be used, and third-party energy companies are not calling this out. It is imperative that you have an interior air barrier as well as exterior air barrier. Same for walls adjacent to porches and patios and the attics of those porches and patios. In the past, in these areas, the insulation was left exposed to uninsulated attics due to the exterior air barrier not being installed. So code now specifically requires it. Not having these, again, you'll see me or you'll hear me say the term over and over again. It's a misalignment of the thermal envelope, either with the air barrier or with the insulation thermal boundary. They must be continuous. They must be aligned. Here they've used OSB, and then where they should have continued OSB due to cost probably savings, they've just used T-ply, and that's fine. But what they've done is continued the air barrier all the way up to the roof line, enclosing the insulation that's on that interior wall on the second floor. So always continuing the air barrier. Same goes for knee walls. which traditionally are left exposed to hot attics or extremely cold attics. The thought was that the resistance to heat transfer that insulation provides was enough. But through research and studies, it was concluded that allows hot or cold air to move freely through the insulation, which greatly lowers the effective R value of that insulation. So a 13 becomes like a 7, 8, or 9, which then greatly lowers the resistance to heat transfer in and out of the building. So if you're on the heated side in winter and you're up in a northern climate, you're heating the interior, that heat is easily transferred through that insulation and then radiates into the colder attic space. Putting an air barrier there will stop or slow that down. Same for southern areas where we're trying to keep hot attic air out of the insulation from getting to the colder surface inside the house. If the walls or interior is cold enough, if hot attic air is able to transfer easily through insulation, it can reach the interior sheetrock, which is a lot colder, and could lead to condensation inside the knee walls. Another reason why you keep air out of knee wall insulation and out of any others that are exposed to unconditioned spaces. Here's the water heater platform that's on the garage wall. Same kind of thing here. It's a structure built in front of an insulated wall that would normally be covered by an air barrier like sheetrock. It's just another platform being built out. But since it's being built before sheetrock, there's not a complete air barrier behind the water heater decking. So code now requires this to be completed by blocking, sealing, and insulating completely underneath and behind these water heater platforms. So it must be sealed off like this. Having this detail in the plans can ensure that a complete air barrier is on the garage side of the exterior wall. Notice I didn't say the garage wall. These walls, as we saw earlier when I added the term garage wall after exterior, these walls from an energy standpoint should be always considered and treated as exterior walls. So from the thermal envelopes perspective, this wall is no different than any other exterior wall. It should not be treated differently. There should not be elements of an incomplete air barrier or an incomplete air sealing from garage to inside. Just because it specifically calls out a garage wall, that garage wall is still an exterior wall. When it comes to a third-party energy verifier, they will see this wall as an exterior wall and try to treat it as such and call out any deficiencies in that. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the garage separation category. Ceiling and attics. So the air barrier criteria is the air barrier of any drop ceiling or soffit shall be aligned with the insulation, and any gaps in the air barrier shall be sealed. Access openings such as pull down stairs, attic knee walls to unconditioned attic spaces shall also be sealed. Then the insulation criteria of that is the insulation in drop ceiling and soffit should be aligned with the air barrier. So if the air barrier is the sheetrock, then it must be in line with the sheetrock. If the air barrier is a scuttle hole or an attic pull down stairs, it must be aligned with that air barrier. So just because you've punched a hole in it and you've installed stairs or you've installed a scuttle hole cover, that still is your thermal envelope. That's the air barrier to the thermal envelope, and it should be insulated as such. Prior, Energy Star was the only one that required attic stairs to be insulated. Builders try to insulate them themselves. It was kind of haphazard. It was a little unsafe to try to weave insulation underneath the stairs. You didn't get a full contact with the foot and footing when you stepped on the stairs. So a lot of that was kind of given up on not being able to do it. Now manufacturers of stairs have caught up to this. They have now produced attic doors that are insulated to an R10, look just like regular attic doors, and are framed the same way. It just has the bottom of the door, instead of it being a panel, is insulated. So those are easily to be done and to meet to be compliant for code. We were just talking about that, but scuttle hole covers, vertical attic knee wall doors, attic pull down stairs should be insulated, air sealed, and weather stripped. I'll say that with the caveat, if you read what the code says on scuttle hole covers, it's not part of this chart, but you can reference a different part of the book, is that vertical knee walls only need to meet the same equivalence of a basement wall. that's in that climate zone. If you don't have a requirement, then it's not really required to be insulated. Vertical doors are a little harder to do, but manufacturers, again, have caught up to that and have insulated doors that can be installed in small vertical access doors. However, those are more expensive. Scuttle holes, if it's just a wood panel or a sheetrock piece that's been removed, that again is hard to insulate, except putting foam board on the outside or on the back side of it on the attic side is usually easy to do with glue or some kind of adhesive tape. But at the least, they need to be air sealed or weather stripped. So on the left here, we have a scuttle hole cover being insulated and all the gaps in the framing are sealed with caulking. You can see that with the white stuff looks like it's been painted. On the right is an attic pull down stairs that is neither air sealed, weather stripped, or insulated. So the rough opening around there, not sealed, should be sealed. Each of these create a misalignment of the thermal envelope, a term I'll be using over and over again, and allows for increased heat transfer, which is why now it's specifically called out in code. So as code gets more and more progressive, it starts to fill the gaps where it's left off and had holes in the envelope, theoretically, holes in the envelope due to how the code was written. So rewriting some of this in the table and clarifying the intent is how they're catching up to plug in these holes in the envelope and making sure that they're both airtight and well insulated. So in the attics, baffles need to be installed to uphold the R value of the blown attic insulation. So correctly installing these baffles means it will fully fill, it needs to be fully filling the cavity. As like you see on the photo on the right, is fully filling the cavity from rafter to rafter, not just partly in the middle. That's the correct position for that baffle to be installed. And on the left, you see another correct position of it being installed on the top plate. As you see, it's stapled to be on the very back side of that top plate, which will ensure that the top plates are covered with insulation and not exposed to attic, unconditioned attic air. I don't know how many times I've seen where they've installed the baffles, they just rolled it down and stapled it to the front of the top plate. There's no way insulation can get over the top plate, and that's a deficiency of the insulation thermal boundary. So it needs to be all the way to the edge so that you can look at it and see blown attic insulation meets the top plate that now meets the wall cavity insulation, and there's no misalignment of the thermal boundary. So here we see a cathedral vaulted ceiling that has baffles that are correctly installed that extend well beyond the depth of the blown attic insulation. For the most part, they're fully filling each cavity. There's kind of one to the left that they broke it in half and just used half of it. With this type of baffling, you can't use 3/4 of it because I mean, I guess you could, it just makes it more difficult to staple in. So they just break them in half. It really should be fully filling that cavity. This reduces wind washing of the insulation, which can mean two different things. Wind washing can either be it's blowing insulation off the top plate, or if this is going to be batt insulation in that vault ceiling, wind washing is basically allowing air to move through insulation, which lowers the R value, which allows for the effective R value of that, which allows for heat to actually hit the cold surface. Doing it this way and fully filling the cavity, making sure it's stapled correctly to the top plate, allows for outside air to enter the attic to replace the exhausting air going through the roof line. So either in continuous ridge vent or turtle boxes or those mushroom caps, either way, it's allowing for insulation or air to exit the top and be replaced at the bottom. So depth markers must be installed and accurately installed. Making sure the depth markers are starting from the beginning point, not folded down. Again, this isn't spelled out in the table. This is reading beyond the interpretation of, you see the table, you know that it needs to have a full R value of insulation. It needs to be complete and aligned and continuous. And how to do that is things like this, making sure depth markers are installed that are in a different section of the book. And then make sure that insulation depth meets the requirement of the R value in that climate zone. It was rare for us to see markers installed that way. I have seen it in the past. If they're done afterwards, if they're not installed before sheetrock is installed in the ceiling, if they're done after sheetrock's installed, it's easy to curl it down and then staple it. That way they don't have to blow as much insulation and it looks the same. So as a third-party verifier, we always took a tape measure or yardstick and just put it down in the insulation in a few random spots to make sure that, yes, those yard markers are where they're supposed to be and stapled how they should, and starting at 1 and not starting at 3 or 4. It's not expected to go out in the insulation and dig out the bottom of that to see it. You can just check it with a yardstick or a ruler. So still on ceilings and attics, even though these are IC rated and it's required to have IC rated, meaning insulation contact rated lights, which is what this is, it allows the insulation to be directly in contact with the housing. Although when you have bats like this, it still should be cut around the can light, not just laid over a can light, so that the insulation comes in direct contact with the sheetrock. Doing it like this leaves gaps and creates pockets where insulation is voided or has a void of insulation that is no longer in contact with the conditioned space. So just because, even when something is airtight, if you have temperature differentials of hot and cold, you will get air movement through the cavity. It's just called convective looping. Air will move up and down through the cavity, regardless of the fact that there's air entering or exiting that same cavity. It's just moving through the cavity due to air convective looping. And so creating hot pockets of air around can lights like this can create a convective loop. And when you have a convective loop and you have air movement through it, it can bring in more infiltration into that cavity, again, reducing the R value of that insulation and the effectiveness of that insulation that's in that cavity. So being able to cut around that and install it correctly, you can put insulation over the top of it if you want, but if the insulation depth is the same depth as the can, it's preferred to have the hole cut around in the insulation bat and have it fit to the sheetrock on the inside and leave the top of the can exposed. Insulating the top of that can is not the goal. So onto walls. So the air barrier criteria: the junction of the foundation and seal plate must be sealed. The junction of the top plate and the top of the exterior walls must be sealed. Knee walls shall be sealed. And then installation criteria is cavities within corners and headers of frame walls shall be completely filled with cavity, or completely filling the cavity with material having a thermal resistance R value not less than R3 per inch. Exterior thermal envelope insulation for frame walls shall be installed in substantial contact and continuous alignment of the air barrier. So same thing here. They're reiterating it again, that the thermal envelope is made up of the air barrier and insulation. They must be continuous and aligned at all times. But as you see, this is where it points out that headers and corners must have at least an R3 per inch. And the previous presentation that we did was talking about advanced framing, and it's not really going over the top advanced framing. It's making sure these little things like meeting the code intent to insulate corners and headers are done. I didn't go into detail with that because we've talked about it before, but putting an R3 board in sandwiched headers is a way to insulate the headers, and then making sure that you do 2-stud or 3-stud corners to be able to get insulation all the way to the back of those corners, and will ensure that you're getting at least R3 per inch in those corners, or if nothing else, you're stuffing it full of insulation to your best ability of what you can reach in there, but not leaving a dead pocket of uninsulated areas. Walls, and when it says in code, it says exterior walls. In our world for energy, that includes, and I know it's kind of a tough term to try to say interior walls are exterior walls, which is not true, but the top of interior walls intersect the attic, which is unconditioned space. At an exterior wall actually separates the outside unconditioned space to the inside conditioned space. The top of those walls and knee walls do the same thing. So when it says exterior walls, there are some builders that say, well, that doesn't include interior walls. I don't have to air seal those because that's not what the code's intent is. The code's intent is anything that separates or is the junction of interior to unconditioned to conditioned spaces. That includes the top plate, that includes knee walls. In this instant, you see gaskets being used. You can use gasket, caulking, or other approved means for sealing the junction of the wall, which is what this is doing on a knee wall. Here are the gaskets being used. But the one on the bottom has nothing backing it up or holding it up. It's what we called a floating gasket. And the gasket should not float. When the sheetrock gets installed, yes, it will lay over the top of that. The only place it's air sealed are the vertical studs. There is no air sealing happening because there's nothing to back up the gasket. So without blocking here, the gasket is ineffective in sealing the front of this joint, and attic air will make its way through there. With an IR camera, you will be able to see that. The electrical boxes below are in an interior wall. They don't have to be sealed. Therefore, when you run a blower door, it's allowing for air exchange in and out of the attic through those electrical boxes. And it's due to this point right here. It's not sealed like it is at the top. There's nothing backing behind that gasket. So framers do it this way. I understand why they do it that way. You build the ceiling to a certain height, and then you come down to put barrel ceilings in, or soffits over bathtubs, or just reducing the ceiling height in a bathroom as opposed to in a bedroom adjacent. But not having gaskets here is detrimental to the blower door and allows air to come through those electrical boxes. So this is just kind of a list of things, just a few examples of air leakage pathways in and around exterior, including the garage wall and the interior walls. It's the electrical boxes, the plumbing and wiring that goes through top plates, the seal gaskets on the bottom. Here we see it on the front of the base plate or seal plate. Normally what you want to see is also the gasket is underneath that plate. As you would an exterior wall, the garage wall needs to have the same thing. And then you have the top plate gasket is also installed. Again, it can be caulking, it can be other means of approved means of air sealing. The easiest thing to do, and I say the less expensive way to do it, is put gasking up, but you have to make sure that the gasket stays and that the sheetrock crew will not remove that when installing sheetrock. It's just a conversation that you have to have with the contractors. A lot of times this blocking is missed where the arrows are showing. So the wall's built up and beyond, and then you've got a ceiling that's in there that's bringing it down. It's leaving kind of a knee wall or a damming over, I think that's a patio in that area. And so you have a misalignment of the air barrier. So you need to create the air barrier at the ceiling plane, which is the junction of unconditioned to conditioned space. And then leaving those open, these are necessary to block them and is from increasing the air tightness of the buildings. Right now, the way code's going, it's kind of in some of the areas you're in a different climate zone, which now increases the air changes per hour. It allows you to have a little bit more leniency on air sealing. In my opinion, I understand why they did it, but they also did it because there's pushback from building associations and stuff that makes it, they argue the point that it makes it costly and more strenuous to try to do that. I get it. But if you've already been doing this because you've already built to 3 air changes per hour, these kind of things shouldn't just be forgotten about. It should always include a complete air tightness. Just because your ACH has gone up doesn't mean that the table that we're looking at is to be less interpreted as its meaning. In other words, it needs to be continuous and aligned of thermal and air barrier creating the envelope. So always being the same way and doing it and building it the same. So windows, skylights, and doors, the air barrier criteria for that, the space between framing and skylights and the jambs of windows and doors shall be sealed. And there's no specific installation or insulation criteria for that. There's not really a requirement for the opening of the window. Headers are mentioned differently. I wish they would also put headers must be insulated here for windows and doors, but they don't. It's in a different category. The framing around the window is what we refer to as the rough opening. The rough opening is always larger than the window or door, and this allows for adjustment during installation. It also can allow for expansion and contraction in between. These small gaps must be air sealed with either caulking or expandable foam. This will prevent or lessen air movement around windows and doors. So the doors that we see now a lot are big 9-foot or 10-foot doors. We got to make sure that I'm up on the steps actually taking this photo to get to the top of that to see the top of the door, but you got to make sure the top of that's actually air sealed. A lot of times they'll do the sides and then they can't really reach the top so they don't foam it, but you've got to be able to get up there and make sure that that is sealed. A lot of time the installers state that when they put the windows in, they're caulked around the frame as they hit the air barrier or framing members on the outside, but you can't always count on that. So that's why it's specifically called out in code that it must be air sealed in between these gaps. So air sealing around skylights. So the air barrier is installed, must be installed over insulation. As you see on the left, again, this comes from the energy.gov website. It's basically saying that a skylight shaft with insulation exposed to the attic should not be sealed. Brad has a question. I've seen insulation shoved in the top of the gap. Yep, that's true. And we'll talk about that in the next one, but code now says anything less than 1 inch can use polyseal. However, if you've got 1 inch or more, it needs to have insulation in there. It should also be air sealed, but it also should be insulated, not just with foam. So we see a lot of times that it's just done with foam. So great point. So other than sealing around the rough openings around the skylights, the shafts must also be insulated as you see to the left, but then that insulation must also have an air barrier on the attic side, and all the seams must be sealed as you see on the right. All of it is sealed. It's enclosing and encapsulating the insulation that's on the inside. This is how that shaft should be done. That's really an extension of the conditioned space all the way to the attic deck, and it should be treated as such, just like you would with exterior walls, garage walls, knee walls. It all should be treated the exact same way. So rim joists. The air barrier criteria, rim joist shall include an exterior air barrier. And then it says the junction of the rim board to seal plate and rim board and subfloor shall also be sealed. The insulation criteria now states, again, coming from 2021, rim joist shall be insulated so that insulation maintains permanent contact with the exterior rim board. That permanent contact wasn't in previous code cycles. So therefore, it was just friction fitted with insulation, and it's still being done like that. That is not a permanent means to maintain contact. Eventually, that will fall out due to expansion and contraction of the fiberglass insulation and the framing members around it. So it really needs to be stapled in, or it needs to have some kind of tiger teeth or wire stay that goes in there. So insulating air sealing is a crucial step when insulating floors over unconditioned basement or crawl space. They are usually insulated and air sealed with rigid foam or spray foam. This practice helps basically a continuous air barrier. Floors can account for 1/4 or 1/3 of the building's enclosure surface area. Air can infiltrate through framing around these band joist areas. That's why they're calling them out to say they need to be done. Defects in the air barrier and insulation system can cause heat loss through floors, over unconditioned basements, and vented crawl spaces. So this results in higher energy costs and uncomfortable cold floors. Air sealing and insulating the band and rim also helps create a complete and continuous air barrier. As we said before, you don't want a misalignment of the thermal envelope, so you're going to include an exterior and interior air barrier along with insulation in between. So rim joists can be sealed with rigid foam cut into place, caulking or spray foam, and then the edges of that ridge foam are in place. So the rims can also be air sealed and insulated in one step using foam insulation. That happens a lot. We see fiberglass bats in the wall and then foam spraying in the cavity of the rim joist. That is a permanent means, whereas putting a friction fit bat is not. To qualify as an air barrier, open cell or closed cell foam must have a finished thickness greater than or equal to, I believe it's 2 inches, 5.5. So I showed on here 5.5 open cell and 1.5 for closed cell respectively. But I think it's around 2 or 3 inches open cell becomes an air barrier. So Brad's also stated in an apartment mid-floor rim joist, does full fill cellulose blown meet the intent, or do bats need to be installed? It doesn't call that out specifically, so it can be cellulose as long as it's fully filling that. So if you have it, and that's a great point, Brad, and we'll talk about it. I think it's in future slides, but if you have an area, either a rim joist or something like under a bathtub, if you fully fill it, then the interior air barrier is no longer required as long as it's fully filled. So fully filling it with blown cellulose does meet the intent. If you can get an interior air barrier in front of it, that's great. But if it's fully filled and it's touching some other interior air barrier, then it's now meeting the intent of code. So rim joists are not only at the perimeter of the building. So a lot of times when we look at it from some people's perspective, you see the rim joists are just, as we always called it, the belt around the house. But when you've got different levels of homes, like a second floor or third floor, and those are different than the first floor footprint, you now must also create rim joists or band joists around the perimeter of the conditioned floor below the second floor, below the conditioned floor above. So creating that, you must separate that. All openings must be blocked. All gaps must be sealed. In this photo, you see the band joist over the garage wall, isolating the floor from the garage and the conditioned space. So on the right, on that floor, it will be insulated. On the left, it will not, because it's between two conditioned spaces. So you're going to separate it with blocking. Some people would leave that open and say, well, I'm insulating this floor over the garage, but therefore the other one doesn't have to be insulated because it's between conditioned spaces, which is true, but you must have an alignment of the air barrier, which is at the end of the insulation of the conditioned floor over the garage. So creating a band joist and air sealing, all of that is what's intended. If it doesn't exist due to, like, if the band joist isn't created by framing or isn't as easily identifiable as over a garage wall, it must be identified where the stopping and starting point of the upstairs conditioned room ends and starts, or attic starts. Then basically you need to create it below that, and those spaces between in that subfloor must also be blocked. This is over a garage, and the blue insulated board or continuous foam board is creating a band joist. Any air barrier will do, and this is meeting the intent. It's an air barrier. It's installed directly below the second floor wall that is separating conditioned from unconditioned attic. So if I was to drill a hole off to the left, I do believe that was attic space, and the one to the right was conditioned floor. So they're making sure that they're splitting that by putting building a band joist in that lower section. A gasket's also been installed below that. As you can see, there's a white gasket being installed. So when the ceiling sheetrock gets installed to the garage, it will be air sealed at that band joist. Having it out of wood is fine, but it's never really cut correctly, and then not sealing that, it's hard to seal that up with caulking or poly if you're trying to put sheetrock up and then you're trying to seal the gap. So putting a gasket below that, making sure that it meets exactly the same level as a sheetrock, means that that air sealing will take place. This is the correct way to do it. It's rarely done to this level of air sealing, but it's the correct way to do it. Using an IR camera with the blower door, you will see all of these areas of deficiency. If that gasket's missing, if that band joist is missing, if poly seal around the band joist is missing, you will see air movement through there with an IR camera. So same thing with that. Even when the band joist is over conditioned space, air sealing must also be done. So here we see a gasket that was installed below that band joist. This is actually over the garage, but there's a gasket underneath that band joist. Actually, this is not. This is over conditioned space, and that's the second floor. And in this instance, they felt it was necessary to put the gasket, which in our world is, because you don't want to, that's not a perfectly level bottom of that beam or TJI where the sheetrock's going to meet. And every gap that you don't have a nail or screw for the sheetrock is leaving a pathway for air to go through. So installing the gasket here is a great way to do that. Again, if it's left off during blower door, you will see this with an infrared camera. You will see air movement through this junction, because every time it doesn't have a staple or a nail or a screw is allowing a pathway for air. So make sure they're still at the bottom. It should be in the scope of work of either the insulators or the air sealers or whoever does poly seal. Lastly, it's a pet peeve of mine, but in this photo, there are also two framing trash pieces of wood that are left in the attic. This creates gaps and deficiencies in the attic insulation, so they should be removed before attic insulation goes in. Most of the time, it won't be. Why? At this point, it's easy because you can just drop it out of the ceiling, but to remove it from it after the sheetrock's been installed means carrying that piece of wood all the way to the attic opening and trying to get it out, or cutting it up. But here we see there's a long 2x8 and then there's a 2x4 or 2x6 up in there, just laying down on the ceiling joists, and those should be removed. Otherwise, when the attic insulation is being blown, if he's too far away from that, it's going to leave a void of insulation directly below that 2x8. Yeah, some of it may fall in and fill that gap over time, but that just means now you have in those areas less insulation depth than what you need because the pocket was left below that piece of trash that was there. So floors, including cantilevers and floors over garages, which we talked a little bit about already. But you've got an air barrier criteria is it shall be installed at any exposed edge of insulation. That's why you create the band joist over the garage wall. And then for the insulation, it's floor framing cavity insulation shall be installed to maintain permanent contact with the underside of the subfloor decking. Or there's also says if you fully fill it, then you don't have to do that. Alternatively, floor framing cavity insulation shall be in contact with the top of the siding or continuous insulation installed on the underside of the floor framing and extend from the bottom to the top of all perimeter floor framing members. In other words, if it's fully filled. If it's touching all sides because you're putting R38 and that TJI is 12 to 14 inches deep and it's fully filling it, then you don't have to try to permanently install something to keep it maintaining contact with the floor above. Most of the time it's only R19, which is code required, or it's R21 or it's R22, which does not fully fill it, and it must be held in contact permanently with the conditioned floor above. And that's usually tiger teeth, staples. It cannot just be wires that are running through the floor or plumbing fixtures that are running through the floor, plumbing pipes that are running through the floor. It may hold that portion up, but where you don't have those wires and piping, it needs to have something that's permanent that adheres that insulation to the floor. With this, the floors, including cantilever floors, so a gasket should be placed here. In this instance, they didn't do it. This is over a garage, and they didn't put a gasket underneath it. If you have to think about it, the best way to think about it is the conditioned floor above, that's also an unintentionally conditioned subfloor. And yeah, the thermal boundary will be above it, but you need a complete air barrier encapsulating that insulation. So this is one instance where if you had R22 and it was pushed up against the floor, but the air barrier is the sheetrock, that's kind of misalignment of that air barrier and insulation. But code allows that to be less. You don't have to require 38 here. But if you look at it, electrical boxes within that subfloor should also be sealed. And then all penetrations that are made through that band joist should also be sealed. The wires running through those TJIs through there don't have to be sealed because it's part of the conditioned floor. That it's not breaching it into an unconditioned area like the garage. So the air barrier criteria for basement, crawl space, and slab foundations, we won't spend too much time on this. Most of Texas doesn't really do basements or crawl spaces. Although the older existing housing stock does have crawl spaces, most of them aren't built with new houses. Some are. The exposed earth and unvented crawl spaces shall be covered with a Class 1 vapor retarder or air barrier in accordance to Section R402.2.1.1. Any penetrations through the concrete foundation walls and slabs should also be air sealed. A Class 1 vapor retarder shall not be used as an air barrier on below grade walls and shall be installed in accordance to Section R702.7 of the IRC. And then the insulation says crawl space insulation were provided instead of floor insulation shall be installed in accordance to Section 402.2.10. That tells you how to do the crawl space walls. And then conditioned basement foundation wall insulation shall also be installed in accordance to Section R402.2.8.1. And then slab on grade floor insulation shall be installed in accordance to Section 402.2.10. So there's different ways of doing it, and then they give you which section of book needs to be followed if you're going to do that. So as in this case, R402.2.10, crawl space walls shall be insulated in accordance to, now it references the table of 402.1.3. There is an exception saying crawl space walls associated with crawl space that is vented must be insulated in accordance to table R402.1.3 and section 402.2.7. And then where basement walls are insulated, the insulation shall be installed from the top of the basement wall down 10 feet below grade or to the basement floor, whichever is less. So I know that's always a trick question on the test. It has that test question of, do I have to do it all the way down to 10 feet if it's only 6 foot tall? Nope, it only has to go to wherever the floor is, which is less than 10 feet. So R402.7 or 4.2.2.7 basically says the insulation shall be installed to maintain permanent contact with the underside of the subfloor. We talked about that a minute ago, but being installed permanently with either staples or wire stays, not just friction fit, allowed to be falling out later on. In accordance to the manufacturer's instructions, and maintain the R value and readily fill the available cavity space. So if it fills it fully, you don't have to do the permanent stay. Floor framing cavity insulation shall be permitted to be in contact with the top side. We talked about that a minute ago. And then any combination of cavity and continuous insulation shall be installed so that the cavity insulation R value is correct. So you can do different myriads of things. So if you have, let's say, R10 stapled underneath, like the floor over a basement, unconditioned basement, and you're just putting R10 underneath it, you can do whatever you need to increase the R value to whatever your climate zone requires by doing cavity insulation above it. So you can use a combination of both of those. With this, it just kind of shows crawl space insulation being placed under the floor or on the crawl space walls. If installed in the walls, it must not be a vented crawl space. And the floor covering, the ground floor, the ground, the dirt, the exposed dirt. If it's concrete, then you don't have to do anything if it's concreted in. But if it's exposed earth, it must be covered with a vapor retarder, and all seams must overlap by 6 inches and be taped. A vapor barrier must extend up the wall and the stem walls at a minimum of 6 inches. And then insulation installed in the floor must be, again, maintain permanent contact with the conditioned floor above, using wire stays, also known as tiger teeth, or staples, just something that's meeting the intent of code to actually hold it. That picture on the right, they're using the wire stays. Some people call those tiger teeth, and it's holding that insulation in place. It is kind of compressing at those areas, but the intent is you need to hold that insulation in contact with the conditioned floor above. And so that is meeting the intent. Slab edge insulation is now in the code from climate zones 3 through 8 and must be insulated on that for slab edge insulation. The exception is if the code official has determined the area as a high termite infestation area, this requirement is exempt. Most of North Texas is that way. I think a lot of Texas is that way. But if not, you'll need to talk to the chief building official or building official to say, how are y'all recommending this, and are you requiring it to be insulated? Here you can see a diagram on the left showing the slab edge and under slab insulation. You don't have that termite. I don't believe you have that termite exemption. If it's a heated slab, it needs to be insulated. You may have to still do underneath the slab and not on the edge. But on heated slabs, they must have insulation underneath it, separating it from the ground. And then on the right, you can see specifics that must be met, including the depth of the insulation and the slope away from the wall. It also shows a 2 foot of pea gravel or crushed stone at a thickness of 4 inches for pest protection. It shows the ground slopes away from the wall at least 5%. That's about 6 inches per 10 feet. And then you see that rigid insulation at whatever climate zone you're in will tell you the depth required. So in climate zone 3, it's R10 with a depth of 2 feet. So that, if you pictured this, would be 2 feet down, and then you still have to have the sloping away from that. And what they're doing is also having a continuous insulation on the outside, and it's meeting the junction of that where it meets the slab insulation. So there's a continual thermal boundary on the outside of that exterior wall. So shafts and penetration. So duct flue shafts or to exterior or unconditioned spaces shall be sealed. Utility penetrations of the air barrier shall be caulked, gasketed, or otherwise sealed, and shall allow for expansion and contraction of materials and mechanical vibration. Insulation shall be tightly fitted around utilities, passing through shafts and penetrations into the building, and the thermal envelope must maintain the required R value. So that's a lot of wording there just to say you need to make sure it's air sealed, and then you need to push insulation as close as you can to what's penetrating through that within means of, if it's a flue pipe or a some kind of combustible piping that's there. You can't have combustibles in touch with it. We'll see that next, I think, on the, well, maybe not on the next slide, but these shafts need to be sealed. Basically, what you're doing is you're identifying the envelope. On the right-hand side, you see a duct or a flue going through there. They have identified that that is part of the thermal boundary. And so they're going to put that alignment there, and they're going to block it and seal. And on the left, you see two bath fan ducts going through the band joist, which are also being air sealed at that point. So these all must be blocked and sealed in order to separate the conditioned from unconditioned spaces. A great example here of like a duct chase. So in order for the ducts to run to the attic, a chase has been created. And then the top is now required to be blocked and sealed. The blocking here has been done, but there is some air sealing that's lacking on the far right-hand side where that arrow is. Not sure what happened. Either they ran out of poly seal, or they just didn't get around to it, or for some reason it had to be cut bigger so the duct would have less crushing around it. Not really sure what happened. But it should all be sealed here. According to manufacturer specs, when you look at it, that gap that's there where the arrow is pointing to is bigger than what the expandable foam should be doing, and should be sealing. It should be blocked by a solid material and then air sealed, but 9.5 times out of 10, that will just be poly seal if they can get it to stay. If not, it will fall through that opening. And for some reason, they're going to continue to keep trying until it fully fills it. Not the best way to do it. Bill says, is there a checklist that covers this information, or even better, a checklist with photo and examples? Kind of what we're doing here, Bill. Unfortunately, no, there's not. This is, as I said in the beginning, this is a lot of times recreated as a checklist in an inspection app and or inspection PDF or something that's on a digital means like an iPad. They're using this as a checklist. Otherwise, it's just general requirements in code that have to be followed. They used to be listed as mandatory, but now they're just listed as you're going to, no matter what pathway you're following, it needs to be done. You can make a checklist out of it, but unfortunately, they don't really go to that extreme. Doing things like this or having other entities like SPEER put together checklists, and third parties put together checklists that really cover all these items. And as I said, we also were made to take photos to prove that we were there and have it geolocated and stamped. And it shows that the checklist was followed and that all things were done on that site. So the builder correctly identified this thermal envelope here. This is what I see a lot of times is they don't think this through. It's not on the plans this way. All they were really doing is they're building the exterior wall. They're building a fireplace in front of it. And then someone is determining where the air barrier and insulation boundary is to create the thermal envelope. Sometimes it's just left open. Maybe it's capped at the top, but it's not insulated in the back. Now they're going to insulate the back, but now they need to put T-ply in front of it, but they don't want to, so they try to put netting. You could do the front walls, but now you have to do T-ply on the back, and then you have to insulate the inside, and then you got to put sheetrock on the front. Either way, you must have a continuous and aligned thermal boundary, including air barrier and the thermal boundary making up the thermal envelope. So it never surprises me to see they leave this open. The top is capped here. This was done as it was being built. The air barrier is complete. The insulation, which I confirmed was behind the T-ply that was here, is completely encapsulated. All the gaps, even on the sides of the framing, have been poly sealed. All the holes penetrating through that have been sealed, just like you would anything else on an exterior wall. They've done it correctly, which means everything in front of that no longer matters. If you leave it open to interpretation, now everything about this matters, and you have to decide where is your starting and stopping point to align the thermal envelope with the rest of the house. This is the right way to do it. Back to that scenario of think of it as a square box, and now you built a fireplace in front of it. You still need an air barrier inside of the insulation that's on that back wall. So this is the correct way of showing how it should be done. And then we talked about it a minute ago, and this is the photos for that. Not as easy as filling the gaps between the flue pipes. Most of the time, contractors will use the excuse of, I can't seal the gap between the pipe and the flange. As you see on the left-hand side, the photo shows it's being done correctly with fire caulk. It's a specific color so that the fire marshal or building official can assure that that's a fire barrier or a draft stop for fire. It's always an acceptable means to have it done this way. And then of course maintaining clearance with insulation around it for not to come in contact with the flue pipe. They have a minimum. They show a 3-inch around there. I think the minimum is just 1 inch for combustibles, but they made sure they blocked around it. And as you see, they made sure they blocked the. In this picture, it's vertical according to the horizontal of the ceiling rafters, and they basically boxed it around, air sealed that box entirely, air sealed around the flue pipe. And that's how you air seal it. On the right hand side, they put a flange that has a sleeve with the flue pipe going through the middle with no air sealing. If you look close enough between the square part of this flange and the round hole, that's either cellulose or that's fiberglass insulation showing through, which means it's not fully air sealed. And a lot of them will say, I can't because the fire marshal won't allow it. But if you use fire caulk, they absolutely will. You just have to use the right product to do it. We've seen this before in previous webinars. I won't stop harping on it, but the top of this chase must be capped and sealed from the attic. And the thermal envelope location needs to be identified and determined if it's the back wall or the front wall. They have options. They can do one or the other. Here, they didn't do anything. The front wall cannot be considered as its interior air barrier if you don't cap the top. I mean, you can do the front wall if you wanted to and not cap the top. You can just do the insulation on the front wall and then air seal the back of it with a T-ply or OSB and then sheetrock on the front. Now that makes you have the front wall as your thermal envelope. It's really misaligning it. It's jutting it out into the room. It's misaligning it with the rest of the home. It's also where that Smurf tube comes down. You've got 2 open boxes that aren't air sealed. There's no way to air seal those. And you're going to leave those open to a chase that actually is open to the attic. Not a good idea. So insulating the back and then putting T-ply on the back is the perfect way to air seal and keep the envelope aligned. But now you have an opening at the top. Doing it that way, you now have the flue pipes exposed to uninsulated sheetrock in front of them, which again is not a good way to do it. There has been several times that I've gone out on either an energy audit or a warranty claim for a builder because the homeowner says that that room is overheated. And the minute you walk into the home and you look down on the garage and you see where the water heaters are and you look up and know that that's where the bedroom in question is, you know that that's going to be the problem. You go in with an IR camera and you see 2 active flue pipes heating up that space behind it, therefore transferring heat into that room. This is a media room, which means from time to time, they're going to close these doors. And when those hot water heaters are actually heating, it's going to actually heat up that media room. I mean, it depends on how much hot water is used. They will cycle on and off. And when they do, it's going to heat up and be a heated, almost like a heated furnace that's actually getting into that media room. Not perfect, not the ideal way of doing it. They should probably have angled those flue pipes up and away as quick as they could out of the house and go up to the right. But instead, they just go all the way up to the roof line. Not anything of energy that you can call out to say, hey, you need to move those flue pipes. It's just, now I have to make sure that it's air sealed at the top and it's capped at the top and it's insulated where the thermal boundary meets the outside envelope and it's done correctly. So here, again, you'll probably see this in future webinars. It's just something that I can't believe was still done. And from what I saw when this house was being built, it was never corrected. It was insulated on the back. It was netted in front of that insulation. And then it was batted on the top with netting holding the bats in place. There is no air barrier at the top. I don't know how this house is going to get through on a blower door. Like this, it should have been capped at the top. So closing the gap with blocking and sealing all gaps and seam and sealing around penetrations through the top plate is what's required. As you see, there's a vent stack going through it. It's sealed. It's either a 2x4 or 2x6 that's actually been nailed in place on the top and then poly sealed all the way around. And as you can see, they also did the foam gasket around the top, and then they did a foam gasket below the TJI, separating it from an unconditioned attic into a conditioned subfloor. So this has been done correctly. Narrow cavities, we mentioned that a minute ago when Brad had his question, but any narrow cavities now in the 2021 code book says if it's 1 inch or less, do not have to be insulated, but they just need to be air sealed. And then bats to be installed in narrow cavities that's greater than 1 inch, but not quite as 16-inch on center, shall be filled with insulation that is installed to readily conform to the available cavity space. In my opinion, this is a way of them saying you can't just crush a 14.5-inch bat to make fit into a 6-inch opening. It needs to be cut to readily conform with the cavity space. When you take a 14.5-inch bat and cram it into a 6-inch opening, you've made more of a solid than you do a air permeable insulation out of it. So the resistance to heat transfer is reduced. So it should never be just crushed and crammed in there. It should be cut to fit. So as they said, it's hard to cut a 1-inch slip of insulation. So someone rewrote that part of the code book in that table and said, just allow polyfoam to go in it. It is trapped air. It does have an R value. It will suffice with those smaller gaps less than 1 inch. Anything larger than that must be insulated. So here's an example of a narrow cavity, less than 1 inch, does not have to be insulated, must be fully filled with expandable foam. So as we see to the right, the door around that, that's almost bigger than 1 inch. It's right about 1 inch, so no one's going to call that out, but it still should be air sealed. So we said that earlier, it should be air sealed and insulated if it's bigger than 1 inch and not like this. So I took this picture when I inspected this house probably about 2 years ago. I still use it in my presentations. This is why the code intent is rewritten time and time again to specifically stop this. This should be insulation, not fully filled with foam. In my opinion, if they don't cut it gently with a knife to the level of where the sheetrock's going to go, it's all just going to be scraped out so that the sheetrock will be installed. It will not be insulated. It will increase the heat transfer through these sections. Hopefully there's a big enough patio that it doesn't get direct sunlight. My house faces due west, so if this was my house, then that would absolutely be the wrong thing to do because it's going to be left open. Sorry, I paused for just a second. I have a screen that wants to turn off and I can't fix the settings, so it wants to turn off after a few hours. So fully filling this with foam, this shouldn't happen. It really should not happen. It needs to be insulated. If it's a gap that's big enough that should still be air sealed, like around a door or a window, then yeah, it should be sealed somehow and then have insulation installed to keep it insulated. Just fully filling it with foam, in my opinion, is just a lazy way to do it, and it's not going to meet the intent of what code's looking for. The garage separation, air sealing shall be provided between the garage and conditioned spaces. And then insulated portions of the garage separation assembly shall be installed in accordance to section 303 and R402.2.7, which those say R303 is about materials, system, and equipment. It's long, it's lengthy. I didn't put all of it in here, but it does explain kind of how you're supposed to do it. You're right, Bill. Yeah. Bill says, excellent example. We can use this presentation to create our own checklist. Absolutely. That's why I did this. I know I've done something similar to it before. I wanted to dive deeper into this with photos to be able to try to have some people use this in the field as examples of what should be done and how it should look. And then 402.2.7 is insulation shall be installed and maintain permanent contact. Same thing as earlier. It's got to be in contact with the conditioned side or fully filled with the R value that readily fills that cavity. And then floor framing cavity insulation shall be permitted to be in contact with the top side. That basically just saying it needs to extend from the top to the bottom, not leaving a gap and not leaving top plates exposed. And then any combination of cavity and continuous insulation can be used to meet the R value of intent. So garage separation, garages should be completely separated from all conditioned spaces, including base plates, garage walls, underwater heater platforms, conditioned subfloors over garages, electrical boxes and subfloors, anything on the garage wall on both conditioned and unconditioned side. Here we see a band joist openings being sealed and a seal gasket being installed under the base plate of the garage wall that separate conditioned from unconditioned. This is where I said earlier about most of the time these walls are considered a garage wall, not an exterior wall. I don't know why I just did air quotes. You guys can't see that, but it's an exterior wall. In an Energy World's checklist, it's an exterior wall. It must be treated as such. The slip gasket or slip sheet or moisture barrier or moisture stop is what this gasket is titled usually. It's not always about air sealing, it's about moisture stop. But it also acts as an air barrier. So when you put it around the exterior walls of the rest of the house, that's great. It's a moisture stop, it's a moisture barrier, it's a moisture break, but it also acts as an air sealer. Same thing with the garage wall. You still need a moisture gap, a moisture break, which can act like an air sealing. Energy Star says this has to be done per their checklist. Code doesn't say that. It says it more generally by saying garage should be completely separated from all conditioned spaces. Well, that doesn't tell you specifically what it means. Putting polysil on the interior base plate of the garage wall is, in my opinion, only half the battle. When someone washes out or power washes the garage, a lot of times that's left with that. And then Dylan says, is a tuck under garage seal considered an attached garage if there is no door connecting the garage to the living space, like a garage has a unit above, but connected doors lead to unconditioned hallways? I would say that your only worry, and that's a great question, Dylan, the only worry is the floor above. If it's a conditioned floor above, you need to air seal that. It should have in my opinion, should have a picture frame gasket around the bottom of all those band joists, and or TJI banding or anything that's creating the separation, and separate that from the unintentionally conditioned floor above. However, if the walls of that garage are not attached to living spaces, then none of this really matters, except the gasket underneath it should be a moisture stop. But if you're talking about energy doesn't call out moisture stops. That's the IRC calling out, saying it needs to have it underneath it. It probably by building code should have it, but it has nothing to do with air sealing. So that's a great question. So band joist openings on the garage wall, all penetrations on the garage wall, under and around water heater platforms. We talked about that previously. We'll see that again. If conditioned floor above, all ceiling penetrations should be sealed. We just talked about that with what Dylan brought up. And then valve boxes should also be framed to, I should say, decrease air or increase air sealing, decrease air movement. And that's actually on the next slide. So some builders take it to the next level. They actually picture frame around the garage wall. That's what I was saying. We're picture framing the floor above. It's there if they're conditioned floor above it, but they're picture framing the garage wall. So before sheetrock or sheathing goes up, they put gasket all the way around the doors, around any openings, around any gaps. The green arrow is showing where they framed the valve box, and it reduces the changes of air transfer in and out of that cavity. They've got foaming on both sides, which closes that gap between the piping, and then they got it framed. So if air, when air gets into that cavity space where the valve is, because it has to be accessible, when you open that box, air can go up and down that cavity. Well, that wall is eventually going to be insulated. And when it's going to be insulated, you don't want air movement into that insulated wall. So it should be framed like this. Again, it's one of those things where code doesn't specifically say this. It says you need to limit air movement into cavities. Well, limiting air movement into cavities means framing things off like this that you know will be exposed because they have to be exposed, but you're lessening what the impact's going to be for the rest of the cavity. So closing that off, in my opinion, should be considered always a requirement for that. But asking it to be done, there's nothing in code that says it needs to be. So no one really does that. Very few builders do that. The garage wall, these are the corners of the garage wall on one side of the back side of that where a conditioned space hits. So they blocked each of those corners. They put the studs in the right place. They're pushed to the further garage side, leaving the corner to be insulated, as we say, advanced framing, either a 2-stud or they just, the way they installed it on the wall, it actually met on that 16-inch on center. There's not a dead space at this garage wall. Then they put the T-ply in, they polysealed the gaps that are there. So to have this correctly planned out and well executed is always beneficial for air movement into those walls. Again, I'll keep reiterating the same thing. These walls, in my opinion, are exterior walls. And yes, this is going to be sheetrocked, but sheetrock alone by itself is not an air barrier. I mean, it is. The material itself is, but the way it's installed leaves gaps. So it's been proven before. That's why you have to have a gap at a gasket or caulking on the junction of the top plate is because sheetrock isn't perfect, wood isn't perfect. There's not nails every 1 inch to close the gap. It's actually 16-inch on center or 18-inch on center, or sometimes even further out, 2 feet on center when it goes across the top plate, leaving a bowing effect in between. And you can slide a credit card in between it. Putting a gasket there closes those gaps. So this builder has decided they're going to put T-ply and air seal that entire spot before and behind sheetrock to not make the sheetrock be its ultimate air barrier. This to me is done correctly. I'll go back with the reiteration of this is from a perspective of an energy inspector or third-party verifier. These are not specific code requirements. This is what it takes to meet the intent of code. But creating a band joist, again, not created by framing, but a band joist must exist directly over the garage wall to the conditioned subfloors above. In this instance, there's a door there leading inside the house. It juts out. So they've created the band joist as it goes horizontally across the screen. And then you've got the vertical TJIs that are going through there. But even the underside of this, the conditioned floor cavity in that area was also blocked underneath and then sealed on both sides. All penetrations through those band joists must also be sealed. As you see, the wire penetrations are sealed. The gaps where the TJI structures don't meet are also sealed. So you're containing the garage, you're containing the conditioned floor that's over the garage, you're self-containing it away from even other conditioned subfloors. Because it's going to be insulated, you must now have it must be enclosed in an air barrier. That's why you're going to create these band joists. But Energy Star also looks at that as a pathway for contaminants. That's why they also mean that needs to be blocked. This is a conditioned subfloor over a garage. We talked about this on a previous slide. Underneath that beam should have a gasket, a poly seal, something that's going to stop that air movement into that subfloor. And then all penetrations running horizontally through that floor also must be sealed if it's going through that exterior band joist part of it. And then all the electrical boxes should also be air sealed. That's leaving that. We've seen it many a times where you're running a blower door and the carpet's still covered with plastic because it's being protected from damage. You run the blower door and the carpet lifts up off the floor. It lifts up, yes, it lifts up because there's air movement through it, but it also could be the fact that it's just a pressure differential allowing for air to go up. And that air around that carpet's going up, but you have to replace it with something. It would not lift without a replacement of air. So there are air traveling into that cavity, being able to lift that carpet off the floor. OSB does have a tongue and groove lapping effect. Most of the time, those are not sealed. They're not glued. They're just allowed to be sealed together on their own, and they're not sealed in any other fashion, which leaves spaces for air movement through there. And so all of that should be self-contained and sealed off. Each interior and garage side electrical boxes must be sealed to limit air movement into the cavity. Also notice the corner of the garage here, they've also put poly seal there. It's a gap smaller than 1 inch, so they just poly seal the corner. If that's overdone, it'll be scraped out by a screwdriver, and then it will just be left as unsealed. You can, in my opinion, in my expertise, and the way I've always looked at it, without getting on the floor and looking at this, but I don't see any evidence of a gasket underneath that plate. I know I can't see directly under it. It could exist. Most of the time, it's not perfectly installed, and you can see the edges sticking out. That's probably not done. Goes without saying, really, but recessed can lights, all of it has caught up with manufacturers. It's still in the code book to say recessed lighting fixtures installed in the building thermal envelope shall be air sealed in accordance to section 402.4.1. And then installation of that is recessed light fixtures installed in the building thermal envelope shall be airtight and IC rated, which means insulation contact, and shall be buried or surrounded with insulation. We saw that picture earlier of the insulation just bowing over the top of it. It should surround the light and go over the top. If it's deep enough or not deep enough to fully cover the can, you at least want that insulation around the can to be in touch with the conditioned side of the sheetrock on the ceiling. But ICAT was a lot of times what they've listed the cans as, but it means IC rated, so it's airtight and then insulation contact. So you can have that. Usually there's stickers inside those cans. With this, I know it's a little bit blurry. I try to get a better picture of this, but If it's installed without a gasket, it should be caulked to the sheetrock or ceiling covering or air barrier around the light. And then now manufacturers usually install the gaskets at manufacturer levels. And so when you open the box, the can already has a gasket on it. Most of the time, it doesn't have to be installed by the electrician. If it has to be installed by the electrician, usually they just throw them away. And when they throw them away, they need to be air sealed with caulking. So these cans have been tested as per the requirement of code to be tested at like no more than 2.0 CFM of air tightness at 75 pascals. That's more than a blower door. That's commercial tightness, not residential tightness or air infiltration side of it. But the gaskets should exist. If they don't exist and you don't see them at pre-drywall, then it needs to be caulked to the sheetrock once it's installed. A lot of times, if the gaskets are here now at pre-drywall and then you get to final, you don't really know if that still exists. You hope that it does and it wasn't taken down or fallen down, but you have to take the advantage of if it's airtight enough and meets the intent of the blower door ACH, then we're going to make sure that it passes. Due to newer light LED fixtures being done, they're more airtight. They have gaskets as well that are pre-installed. This is becoming less and less and less of an issue with the requirement for this. Plumbing, wiring, and other obstructions. So holes, all holes created with wiring, plumbing, and other obstructions, air barriers shall be sealed. Insulation shall be installed to fill the available space around that stuff. So you can't just leave it unexposed or leave it exposed. Unless the required R value can be met by installing insulation and an air barrier system completely to the exterior side of the obstruction. That just goes by saying if you're using continuous insulation, things like that, you may not have to re-insulate it if you've used enough insulation on the outside. Just examples of that should go without explanation, but all penetrations through top plates and other portions of the envelope must be sealed, including plumbing, electrical, and other obstructions. So this is just some of what we see. Shower and tub on exterior and garage walls, which I still consider an exterior wall. So the air barrier installed at exterior wall adjacent to shower and tubs shall separate wall from the shower and tub. Exterior walls adjacent to showers and tubs must be insulated. A lot of people read this as, well, I have an air barrier. It's on the outside wall. Well, as you read through the rest of the checklist, it all says it must contain an air barrier on the inside to complete the thermal envelope. That's why, as we said before, thinking of the box and the way it's built with nothing in it would normally have sheetrock. Now that you're installing a tub in front of it, it still needs an air barrier on the inside where the sheetrock would have been. So in this instance, I was able to shoot two of these pictures this week in houses, just walking the houses. These were predetermined and pre-planned to be insulated and air sealed by dropping T-ply pre-tub and insulation. The one on the left actually has T-ply installed, but there's gaps behind it to where you can insulate it later. The one on the right was already pre-insulated and has an air barrier. What you're doing here is keeping that to being exposed to anything inside of that. The exemption is not in the book, but I usually told a lot of the builders, if you've already dropped the tub and that air barrier doesn't exist, then fully fill it with insulation. If you fully fill it with insulation, then the tub is the air barrier. And you don't have to put another air barrier, but trying to put insulation in that wall and then put an air barrier over the top of it becomes very difficult after the tub's been installed. Brad says in that scenario for multifamily does the gypcrete above the apartment work as an air barrier? You'd have to look at its air permeance to see. I'm pretty sure gypcrete is and can be considered an air barrier, but I would have to look at the air permeance of that. I'm pretty sure that it still is, because I mean, sheetrock is an air barrier, but it's vapor permeable. I believe gypcrete is the same way. It is an air barrier, but it's still vapor permeable. So I'm pretty sure that does meet the intent. So it must contain an interior and exterior air barrier, must fully encapsulate the insulation, can be fully filled, as we said a second ago. Foam is the only other exception to where foam, when it's sprayed, actually creates its own air barrier. So once it creates its own air barrier, it solves both the insulation and air barrier issue and meets the intent. Therefore, just spraying that wall with foam and leaving it that way meets both intent. It does the insulation and the air sealing. It does not have to be shaved down and have an air barrier installed in front of it, because the insulation and foam is thick enough that it is now the air barrier. Electrical and foam boxes on the exterior wall. So air barrier criteria: the air barrier shall be installed behind electrical boxes and communication boxes. Communication boxes was added a few cycles ago. Before, it just said electrical boxes. Now there are phone boxes, there are AV boxes, there are communication boxes, like where you put your cable boxes. Or alternatively, you can use air sealed boxes and install those. There is no specific requirement yet. Even though a water heater and or a AV box is taking up majority of a 3.5-inch cavity, when you go to 2024, someone is trying to rewrite the section of that code to say that it still needs to have insulation between the conditioned and unconditioned space. So you may have to fur out those places to actually still have insulation. It can't be just a big 2x4 section that's uninsulated and allow for heat transfer into the home. So not yet is there a requirement for insulation, but it's coming. Electrical boxes on the wall, you can use airtight boxes or poly, as we see here being done. Includes all exterior boxes or boxes that breach the envelope, including ceilings and walls. Includes walls, ceilings, floors, over garages, crawl spaces, unconditioned basements, or to the outside. If you look at these boxes that are on the wall, this is no one really asked these questions, but if you think about it from the intent and what you're looking at, the air barrier is the outside wall. It's either the T-ply that's on the right or it's the OSB on the left. You see that it's been poly sealed. It's got the drainage plastic that's on there. It's probably airtight on the back. It may or may not have been picture frame with a gasket on the outside. So why is code still asking for these boxes to be air sealed if the air barrier is completely sealed on the outside? And that's because air still moves through that cavity. It can due to convective looping. So you want to stop air from going in and out of that wall. If that wall is 12 foot tall and you have a ceiling that's 12 foot in this area, the top of that wall is going to be hotter than the bottom of that wall, causing air to circulate for convective looping. And what it's going to do is it's going to pull conditioned air through those boxes up into that wall to act as part of that looping. And so you're just unconditioning that kind of air. It's a building science term of what happens, but a lot of builders look at that and say, why do I have to air seal those boxes when they're on an airtight wall because the outer air barrier is already sealed? And it's because you want to stop convective looping, period. I mean, that's the only easiest way to say that is you don't want air to be introduced into the wall. And that also would mean you don't want conditioned air to be sucked into that wall to act as a convective loop. So you're going to stop convective looping by trying to maintain the same temperature uniformly through the wall, if that makes sense. The electrical foam boxes on the exterior wall, these should not be in. What's shown in this picture here is what I consider a communication box, an AV box, a PV drop, whatever you want to call it, where the routers are going to be installed, where cabling is going to be installed. These should never be installed on a garage wall. They shouldn't be installed on an exterior wall. They should always be put on an interior wall, because of all the holes on the back are in there because you want air movement for the equipment to not overheat and not malfunction. If you air seal that on the back, which if it's on the garage wall now has to be air sealed, and we've seen people fully fill all those holes with poly seal, it's an overkill and it's dumb. And now you've risked the possibility of having malfunctioning equipment due to overheating. So they should always be installed on an interior wall if at all possible. As I said a second ago, 2024 IECC being written and published soon will require there to also be insulation behind these boxes. So insulation is still air permeable, that will not overheat the equipment, but you're going to have to fur these out to be able to hold that so you can also get insulation. If installed on the garage wall, it brings contaminants into the home. It can, such as CO, into the house. If air sealed, it could cause damage from the equipment. We just talked about that, but it leaves malfunctioning for the equipment, or can do that. Someone put that is for the garage question. I'm not sure what that means. I may have passed through that. You can, if you want to reiterate that, I will answer that question. HVAC boots. HVAC supply and return register boots that penetrate the building thermal envelope shall be sealed to the subfloor or wall covering that penetrated by the boot. And there's no specific R value requirement. However, if ducts are supposed to be insulated to an R6 or an R8 or whatever pathway you're following, it should maintain that all the way to the inside of the house. And so having them uninsulated means you don't have that. I'll see that we ran a little bit over time. We're almost done. I'll get through this rather quickly. There's the air sealing on that. I know it's blurry, but there's the air sealing for that part of it. Concealed sprinklers. This has always been a touchy subject for me. We're required to be sealed. They should be sealed in a manner recommended by the manufacturer. As far as I know, up to this date, there is no manufacturer that recommends how to air seal them. It's an argument between energy and health and safety with fire code. There is a way to seal it, I think, around that metal can that you see on that orange pipe coming down. However, that is still opened at the top. It doesn't fully air seal that. There are, what I've seen, gaskets on the caps that don't adhere to the sheetrock that can be installed, but most manufacturers don't sell them. It's an aftermarket and they don't recommend it because they didn't approve it. So there's a way that you can seal it. You can build boxes around them like you do existing retrofit of can lights. You can put a box around it and air seal all that to the sheetrock to lessen the leakage points around that. Or, as you see in here, you can make all of them a wall sprinkler, which now you just have to air seal the pipe coming through the top plate. And now it doesn't have to be sealed at the sprinkler can. But that always goes back to it intersects energy and energy and fire code. Fire code will always win out with its health and safety. So I've always tried to put my foot down and say this needs to be air sealed. It is required in code to be air sealed, but then it backs up and says, but it must be approved by the manufacturer. And if you look at any of them, none of them have an approved method of air sealing those yet. I think as now that ACH is leveled out in code and it's no longer getting tighter and tighter and tighter, that may not ever really be an issue. However, if the goal of still doing net zero homes by 2030, you may have to start now reducing air changes per hour again to get there. I'll get off my soapbox with that part of it, but that's just where I stand with that part. So if there's any other questions, feel free to ask them now. I've got just 2 or 3 more slides to go through. If there's a question now, go ahead and ask it and we'll address it. But we are here with, you got a topic? So we're doing a call for presenters. So we're looking for others with a passion for the energy code or energy conservation of any sorts. We're open to hosting a webinar for you. So if you've ever have any questions or someone that's looking for answers in the energy code, please don't hesitate for them to reach out to me if you know anybody that's meets that criteria of could possibly want to do a presentation, just like we had Jeff doing for stucco. He's a real estate inspector, but he's an expertise in stucco. He came and did that for us, and that was great. If you guys want to talk about something or do, that's all we can do. Now, we do have the obligation of we can't have it be a sales pitch for product. You can discuss and talk about the benefits of some of that, but it's not for selling product. It's actually for just talking about the adoption of the energy code or enforcement of the energy code. So after that, we do have 2 more webinars coming up. Sorry if you guys have already registered and are seeing an adjustment to the time. But on June 29th at 11:30, we got understanding and evaluating the manual J and S reports. We've talked about these in the past. It's a heavily viewed video on our YouTube channel. It is presented by Alex Meany, who is now with Mean HVAC. He started his own company. He does specifically training for manual J and manual S and manual D. So he's going to give us some updates and go through some things and answer some questions. And on July 20th at 11:30, we have code requirements for HVAC. It's a rerun that was previously aired on August 18th, 2021. We've been doing this for 39 years, talking again about HVAC. The presenter is Brett Dillon with the Dillon Group. So we'll re-air that on the 20th of July. Otherwise, here is my contact information. You guys are welcome to reach out to me at any time. Feel free to share my information with anybody that you think can use any of our help and or help with adoption and or code enforcement. And again, guys, thanks a lot for this. This was a long one. It spent several weeks putting this together, and I appreciate everybody's time. If you come up with questions later on, please feel free to reach out to me at any time, and we'll go through them in detail. Or just like others have done, shoot me a photo and let's talk about it. I'll either call you or we'll talk about it on text. and we can go through it. So thanks to everybody that's putting on here about the presentation. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your time, and we will see you guys on the next one. Thanks a lot.